It's hard to imagine now, given China's massive presence on the global economic stage. But a few decades ago, China was often compared unfavorably to India in terms of income levels and development prospects. Here's a graph on the nominal GDP of both nations. Data from the World Bank. Here you can see that from 1960 to 1970, India and China's GDP were comparable. In 1964, both nations even nearly had the same economic output. China's GDP at that year was just $59.71 billion, whilst India had $56.48 billion, just a difference of nearly $3 billion. Today, however, China is the world's second largest economy, while India remains a fast-growing economy, but they have a significantly less GDP and even a smaller per capita income. Let's adjust the graph for the two nations. Here, you can see a staggering difference. China's GDP has outshined India by a lot. In 2023, India's GDP was just $3.5 trillion, whilst China had more than $17 trillion. Here's another graph on the GDP per capita of both nations. Data from the World Bank. Here, you can see that from the 1960s to the 1980s, India even had higher per capita income than China. In 1980, they even had a GDP per capita of over $271, whilst China only had $194 at that year. But if we extend this graph to the latest years, we get to see a staggering difference. China's per capita has, just like nominal GDP, far surpassed India. Of course, everyone knows this. Everyone knows that China's economy is much better and stronger than India. But not everyone knows the reason behind China's economic strength. Just, what did China do better that India didn't? Is it because of foreign interference? Could it be because of culture? Well, there's a lot of arguments that people put out every day. But let's talk about some of the most important reasons. Let's first start with history. Back in the 1950s, both countries, China and India, were on par with each other. They were starting from a low economic base. That is because China went through several foreign invasions and later went through civil wars and Japanese occupation. And when 1949 came, the People's Republic of China, PRC, took power under communist leadership. Years of conflict had left the nation impoverished. Industry was minimal. The agricultural system was in disarray, and infrastructure was largely underdeveloped. Likewise, when India gained independence from British rule in 1947. Though India had pockets of industrial development, particularly in textiles, steel, and railways, partly due to British colonial policies, much of the country was still agrarian and faced challenges of poverty, famine, and illiteracy. Both nations were very similar. As a matter of fact, they even had quite similar economic models. In China, when the People's Republic was established, the government under Mao Zedong. Mao was implementing a centrally planned economy based on the Soviet Union's model. China was focused on heavy industries, collectivization of agriculture, and an overall command economy. There were achievements made during these years. But there were also disastrous experiments like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. India, likewise, also had some form of socialism. But unlike China, they had also combined with a democratic framework. Their socialism saw the state as the one that took the lead in critical industries like steel, energy, and telecommunications. But there was one major problem that many critics argued for India's poor economic performance, and it was called the License Raj system. It is where government licenses and permits were required for almost every aspect of business, and it stifled entrepreneurial activity and foreign investment. So, if both nations had similar challenges, what changed? Well, there are two events that occurred between the two countries. For China, it is in 1978, while in India, it is in 1991. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping, who was the president of China back then, had introduced a series of market-oriented reforms in China. This period is referred to as the Reform and Opening Up era. What that basically meant is that China would go from a centrally planned economy to a socialist market economy, where market forces would play a greater role, while the government retained overall control. The government basically gave up some control over businesses and allowed private enterprises to emerge. Before this, the economy was strictly controlled by the state, with all industries and businesses owned by the government. The changes that these brought were then the reasons for China's economic miracle. Here's a graph on China's agriculture, forestry, and fishing, value added, current US dollars. Data from the World Bank compared to India. Back in the late 1970s, both India and China's agriculture, forestry, and fishing industries were very similar. But in just a decade, China's output has posted stronger growth as compared to India. This is largely because of Deng Xiaoping's policies, which saw the de-collectivization of agriculture. Farmers were given more autonomy and could sell surplus production in markets. India, on the other hand, saw its big shift, but it wasn't until 1991 that they did. In 1991, India was facing a balance of payments crisis, which then forced the government to introduce wide-ranging economic reforms under Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao and Finance Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh. This had then led to many changes, like the License Raj requirement to be removed and simplified, which allowed the private sector more freedom to innovate, expand, and compete. Their agriculture, forestry, and fishery value added, however, didn't post extraordinary growth like China until the 21st century. Then, beyond their agriculture, foreign direct investment also played a key role. Deng Xiaoping went on to establish special economic zones in places like Shenzhen, Zhuhai, and Xiamen. These zones enjoyed tax breaks, simpler business regulations, and better infrastructure, allowing them to become hubs for export-oriented manufacturing. Here's a graph on China's FDI inflows, data from the World Bank, compared to India. Here, you can see that both nations had similar foreign direct investment inflows in the early 1980s. But as Deng Xiaoping introduced these new economic policies, the FDI had substantially increased, leaving behind India. India's FDI inflows only increased after the 1991 reforms. In the 1990s, they had also made reforms that eased restrictions on foreign direct investment in several sectors, including automobiles, electronics, and consumer goods. Companies like Suzuki, Hyundai, and others entered the Indian market, partnering with local firms or setting up wholly owned subsidiaries. They had also reduced tariffs rates from an average of over 80% to around 25% in the 1990s, boosting trade and exposing domestic producers to global competition. Hence, if we extend India's FDI data, we get to see that after 1991, India saw its foreign direct investment inflows to surge. But unfortunately, by the 21st century, China's FDI inflows would explode in growth, leaving behind India by far. That is because by this time, even though India had already implemented many reforms, they had still faced many issues that required more reforms. These ranged from bureaucracy and slow implementation of reforms to the fact that China was more politically stable. Being a one-party system, China was able to push through reforms quickly without much opposition. In India, the democratic governance meant that economic reforms were often slowed down by political debates, coalition governments, and bureaucratic hurdles. Thirdly, one very significant factor that made China what it is today is their manufacturing industry. China was focused on having export-led growth. They were exporting manufactured goods to developed countries, especially the United States and European nations, which significantly contributed to its rapid growth. This is because of the reforms made and the strong inflows of foreign direct investments. India, on the other hand, didn't really see their manufacturing sector expand at the same pace as China's. Here's a graph on the industry, including construction, annual growth, data from the World Bank. Here you can see that since 1978, China's industry growth has far surpassed India. And you can see that even after 1991, India's industry growth was still much less as compared to China. It wasn't until the past few years did India's industry growth catch up to China, but that is only because China's industry was already massive. The reason why we used this data set is because it includes manufacturing, construction, mining, and utilities, which are all important for a country's industrial development. This is where India lagged behind as compared to China. Even though they had implemented some policies to support the manufacturing industry, they were lagging behind in things like infrastructure development, which became bottlenecks to their growth. There were poor roads, congested ports, and erratic power supply, which hampered large-scale manufacturing. Here's another graph on the gross fixed capital formation, current US dollars, which is about the investment in infrastructure, machinery, and buildings. Here you can see that China and India had similar spendings leading up to the late 1980s. But after that, China would go on to invest much, much more into this sector, far outspending India by a lot. Hence, these are the reasons as to why China had far outshined India. One can say that they just started earlier. China saw reforms in 1978, while India in 1991. Indeed, that is true. Had India started their reforms in the same year as China, they would arguably be much richer than today. But there's also other reasons involved. We mentioned earlier how China had a structural advantage in their government. They had a centralized decision-maker, which was their one-party government. They had fewer hurdles to establish things like building a high-speed railway or designating a new economic zone. Local governments were encouraged or even mandated to meet certain growth targets, which spurred fierce competition and rapid development. India, on the other hand, had a democratic system. Although it was robust and participatory, it often meant that large reforms required consensus across multiple parties, states, and coalitions. Infrastructure projects could take years or decades due to land acquisition issues, environmental concerns, and legal challenges. This difference in administrative structures and policy execution speed is widely recognized as a core reason for the contrasting development trajectories. On manufacturing, China had deliberately emphasized on becoming the world's factory, which helped it climb the ladder quickly. Manufacturing not only creates jobs, but also facilitates technology transfers, boosts exports, and raises the standard of living through rapid industrialization. As of 2020, manufacturing accounted for around 26% of China's GDP, down from over 30% in earlier decades, while for India, the figure hovered around 14 to 15%. Then we also saw strong infrastructure investments. But let's skip that as we've already discussed it. The fourth reason that we want to bring out, however, is the fact that China has a consistently high savings rate, often over 40%. Here's a graph on China's gross domestic savings, data from the World Bank, as compared to India. Here you can see that even in the latest years available, China's gross domestic savings was much higher than India. This higher savings rate allowed China to invest more in infrastructure, businesses, and industries, fueling its rapid economic growth. A high savings rate means that a country has more money available for investment, whether by the government, businesses, or banks. So, China's rise from a country poorer or on par than India in the late 1970s to an economic behemoth today is one of the most remarkable development stories in modern history. But anyway, do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.